The anticipation had been building for months. The world of combat sports was abuzz with the prospect of a matchup that, on paper, seemed impossible. Jake Paul, the YouTube sensation turned professional boxer, had been on a relentless campaign to prove his worth in the sport. And what better way to do it than by stepping into the ring with Canelo Alvarez, the undisputed king of boxing? The negotiations had reached a fever pitch. The contracts were drafted, the terms were scrutinized, and the fans were salivating at the thought of an unlikely collision between two figures from vastly different worlds. But just as the finishing touches were being put on the deal, the unthinkable happened. Canelo Alvarez walked away. Instead of facing Paul, Alvarez signed a lucrative 4-fight deal with Turki Alashik and Riyadh Season, a move that immediately shattered the hopes of millions who had been eager to witness the spectacle. For Jake Paul, it was a public humiliation. He had built his brand on bold challenges, calling out the biggest names in combat sports, forcing them into corners where they had to respond. He had turned from internet provocateur into a genuine fighter, at least in the eyes of some. But now, with Alvarez opting for a different path, Paul was left without an opponent and, perhaps worse, without the validation he had been desperately seeking. His response was as explosive as ever. In a campaign of fury and frustration, Paul took to social media, launching a scathing attack on Alvarez. He accused the Mexican boxing legend of running, of ducking him out of fear, of selling out for a Saudi payday instead of taking on a real challenge. He released leaked contracts, desperate to prove that the fight had been set in stone, that Canelo had backed out, that Paul was the wrong party in all of this. But as the dust settled, not everyone saw things from Paul's perspective. Enter Michael Bisping. A name etched into the annals of UFC history, a fighter who had carved his legacy with grit, determination, and an unbreakable will. Bisping had never been one to mince words, and when it came to Jake Paul, his patience had long since worn thin. It started with a video. Bisping, seated in his usual setting, leaned in toward the camera, his expression one of exasperation. He had seen enough. Jake Paul is at it again, making an absolute fool out of himself, he began, his voice laced with irritation. Calling out Canelo Alvarez, making videos, dancing around in a sombrero with his shirt off. Paying absolutely no respect and saying that Canelo Alvarez is ducking him and showing contracts. And apparently, they were all signed to fight, but then he's terrified, and he's gone off to Saudi Arabia and he's selling his soul and all the rest of it. Bisping paused for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then, with a voice that carried the full force of his disdain, he added, "Shut the hell up, Jake Paul." The internet exploded. Paul's supporters rushed to his defense, claiming he had every right to expose what they believed was Alvarez's cowardice. But Bisping wasn't done. He wasn't just criticizing Paul for his antics, he was questioning the very foundation of his boxing career. "I am very glad that Canelo Alvarez will not be gracing the ring, stepping into the squared circle with that imposter, with that fake, with that wannabe," Bisping declared. His words were a dagger, aimed straight at the heart of Paul's carefully curated persona. Jake Paul has been a tremendous businessman, okay? He is not a fighter. It wasn't just an attack, it was a dismissal. The feud between Bisping and Paul was nothing new. Years earlier, there had been whispers of a potential fight between the two, but Bisping had always brushed it off as nothing more than a circus act. Paul, for all his bravado, had never been in a real fight, at least not in the sense that Bisping understood. The UFC veteran had bled for his victories, fought through injuries that would have broken lesser men, and faced some of the most dangerous fighters in the world. To him, Jake Paul was a performer, a marketer, a showman, but not a fighter. The fallout from the Alvarez situation only reaffirmed that belief. Meanwhile, as Paul tried to recover from the collapse of what could have been the biggest fight of his career, UFC CEO Dana White seized the moment to twist the knife. During the UFC 312 post-fight press conference, White was asked about Alvarez choosing to fight elsewhere instead of facing Paul. His response was classic Dana: brutal, unapologetic, and dripping with sarcasm. Paul had been a thorn in the UFC's side for years, challenging its fighters, criticizing its pay structure, and positioning himself as a disruptor in the industry. White, never one to back down from a feud, had relished every opportunity to belittle Paul's ambitions. This was just another chance to pile on. Despite the backlash, Paul and his team at Most Valuable Promotions were already shifting gears. The Alvarez fight was gone, but there were other opportunities on the horizon. Talks of a rematch with Tommy Fury began circulating, reigniting the story of Paul's only professional defeat. Fury, after pulling out of a recent fight, was still considered a viable option for Paul's return to the ring. Other names were also being whispered: high-profile opponents who could give Paul the spectacle he needed. But the damage had been done. Paul had built his career on controlling the narrative, on forcing the world to see him as a real contender. Yet, in the wake of the Alvarez fallout, he found himself on the defensive. The leaks, the insults, the desperate attempts to reclaim his lost opportunity, it all reeked of insecurity, of a man grasping for something just out of reach. And Bisping, watching from the sidelines, was more than happy to remind him of that fact. As the days passed, the debate raged on. Was Jake Paul truly being ducked, or had he simply bitten off more than he could chew? Did he deserve the fights he demanded, or was he nothing more than a well-packaged illusion? For now, the answers remained elusive. But one thing was certain: Jake Paul's war with the combat sports world was far from over. And as he plotted his next move, his enemies were waiting, ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. The storm surrounding Jake Paul's failed fight with Canelo Alvarez refused to die down. Instead, it grew, feeding on the fiery opinions of fighters, promoters, and fans alike. Each passing day brought a new layer of controversy, and Paul, ever the agitator, refused to let the world move on. He wasn't just angry, he was on a mission to prove that he was the wrong party, that Canelo had been the one to retreat, that the world had witnessed yet another example of boxing politics at play. But no matter how much he tried to steer the narrative in his favor, his critics weren't having it. Michael Bisping, having already torn into Paul with a brutal verbal assault, wasn't done making his stance clear. He saw Paul as an outsider, an entertainer masquerading as a fighter, a businessman manipulating the system for personal gain. To Bisping, the notion that Paul had any right to call out Alvarez one of the greatest boxers of all time was not just laughable, it was offensive. Jake Paul's entire career has been smoke and mirrors, Bisping scoffed in another follow-up. Every fight has been carefully selected, strategically planned, and yet he still wants to talk as if he's one of the greats. It's embarrassing. And Bisping wasn't alone. Fighters from both the boxing and MMA worlds weighed in, some dismissing Paul's credibility, others accusing him of being nothing more than an opportunist trying to cash in on bigger names. Even those who had previously praised Paul for bringing new attention to boxing were now questioning his methods. But Paul, stubborn and unrelenting, refused to be silenced. His attacks on Alvarez escalated. He continued to mock the legendary boxer, calling him a sellout, accusing him of being afraid, taunting him with clips of past fights where he had struggled against opponents Paul deemed inferior. His social media was a battlefield, with videos, screenshots, and rants aimed at tearing down Alvarez's reputation. Still, Alvarez remained quiet. The Mexican superstar had nothing to prove. He had fought and beaten the best in the world. He had endured wars inside the ring that Paul could never comprehend. He wasn't about to engage in a war of words with a man he didn't even consider a legitimate opponent. Instead, Alvarez let his actions speak louder than any insult Paul could hurl. The deal he signed with Turki Alshik and Riyadh Season wasn't just lucrative, it was historic. It secured him 4 fights against elite-level competition, each one promising a payday that would make any fighter's jaw drop. While Paul fumed over the lost opportunity, Alvarez was already looking ahead to what would likely be one of the biggest stretches of his career. But Paul wasn't ready to move on. Behind the scenes, his team scrambled to salvage the situation. The failed Alvarez fight had left a void in Paul's plans, one that needed to be filled as soon as possible. Without a high-profile opponent, Paul risked losing the momentum he had built. And so, new negotiations began. Tommy Fury's name was back in the mix. Their first fight had been a spectacle, a grudge match that ended with Fury handing Paul his first professional loss. A rematch had always been a possibility, but now, with the Alvarez fight off the table, it was being pushed to the forefront. Paul's team reached out, trying to lock Fury in for another showdown. But Fury, fresh off his own struggles, wasn't committing just yet. Talk stalled, and once again, Paul found himself in limbo. The uncertainty only fueled his frustration. He lashed out at Fury, claiming he was scared, that he was avoiding the rematch because he knew the first fight had been too close for comfort. He challenged him publicly, daring him to step back into the ring and prove that his victory wasn't a fluke. Still, no contract was signed. Meanwhile, Dana White was enjoying every second of Paul's predicament. At the UFC 312 post-fight press conference, White didn't hold back. When asked about Alvarez's decision to walk away from the Paul fight, the UFC CEO smirked, leaned forward, and delivered a response that sent the internet into a frenzy. Jake Paul thought he was gonna get Canelo? That's hilarious, White chuckled. Canelo's got real fights to take. Not clown fights. The reporters in the room laughed, the clip went viral, and Paul found himself once again in White's crosshairs. Their feud had been ongoing for years, with Paul constantly taking shots at the UFC's business model, fighter pay, and White's leadership. Now, with the Alvarez debacle making headlines, White saw the perfect opportunity to remind the world that, in his eyes, Paul was nothing more than a joke. But Paul wasn't about to let White have the last laugh. He fired back immediately, accusing White of being a hypocrite, of being scared to let UFC fighters face him in the boxing ring, of protecting his business at the expense of fighters' earnings. It was the same argument Paul had used before, but this time, it felt different. This time, there was desperation in his voice. He needed a fight. The Alvarez fight had been his ticket to legitimacy. It had been his chance to prove that he wasn't just a sideshow, that he could stand toe-to-toe with one of the greatest boxers alive. But now, with that fight gone, Paul was left searching for a new angle, a new opponent, a new way to keep his name relevant. And as he plotted his next move, his enemies watched closely, waiting for the moment he would stumble again. Because in the world of combat sports, reputations are built on victories, but they are destroyed by desperation. And Jake Paul, for all his bravado, was starting to look desperate. Jake Paul had built his empire on controversy. Every move, every insult, every fight had been carefully calculated to generate headlines. He thrived in the chaos, turned backlash into fuel, and somehow always managed to come out on top. But this time, things were different. The collapse of the Canelo Alvarez fight had left a void that even Paul's most dedicated fans couldn't ignore. The usual bravado, the taunts, the over-the-top antics, none of it seemed to be working in his favor. Instead of looking like the fearless disruptor, Paul was starting to look like a man scrambling to keep himself relevant. And his critics could smell the desperation. Michael Bisping, never one to let an opportunity slip by, continued his attacks. His words were sharp, cutting deeper than before, as if he sensed that Paul's armor was finally starting to crack. "It's all unraveling for him," Bisping said in another video. Jake Paul can't handle the reality that real fighters don't take him seriously. He can keep screaming about contracts, keep calling people cowards, but at the end of the day, Canelo doesn't need him. Nobody needs him. The word stung. For years, Paul had worked to force his way into the boxing conversation, to make himself unavoidable. He had picked apart MMA legends, embarrassed critics who doubted his skill, and pushed himself into the headlines of a sport that had tried to reject him. But now, With the biggest fight of his career slipping through his fingers, he was starting to realize that no matter how loud he was, no matter how much money he threw around, he couldn't force his way into the elite ranks. And the combat sports world was more than happy to remind him of that fact. Dana White was particularly ruthless. During another UFC event, a reporter brought up Paul's ongoing feud with Canelo Alvarez. White laughed. "Jake Paul? He's still talking about that?" White smirked. "Guy needs to move on. Maybe go fight another retired MMA fighter." The crowd of reporters chuckled, and just like that, White had turned Paul's struggles into a punchline. Paul saw the clip. His jaw clenched. He wasn't going to let White or Bisping or anyone else dictate his career. If Canelo was gone, if Tommy Fury was playing hard to get, then he needed another option. And fast. Behind the scenes, Paul's team was working around the clock. They reached out to multiple fighters, searching for the perfect opponent. Someone with name value, someone who could generate pay-per-view sales, someone who would keep Paul in the spotlight. Names were tossed around. A rematch with Nate Diaz? Possible, but their first fight hadn't been competitive enough to justify a second. KSI? The British YouTuber turned boxer had already been in Paul's orbit for years. But negotiations had always been messy. A fight with a legitimate boxer? That came with too much risk, especially now, when Paul couldn't afford another loss. But time was running out. The more the days passed, the more the world moved on. Alvarez had already begun promoting his next fight. Dana White had bigger things to focus on. Bisping had already set his sights on the next fighter to criticize. Paul was on the verge of being forgotten. And that was something he would never allow. So, he did what he always did. He went back to what made him famous in the first place. He took to social media, unleashed a new round of insults, and made a dramatic, attention-grabbing announcement. "I'm done waiting," Paul said in a video, standing in his private gym, his hands wrapped, his face full of intensity. "Since Canelo is running, since Tommy Fury is too scared, I'm moving on. And I'm gonna fight someone that actually wants it." The internet went wild. Who was it? Who had agreed to step into the ring? Was it another UFC legend? A former world champion? Another influencer looking for fame? Paul let the suspense build. And then, he dropped the name. It wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't a fight that made sense. But that had never stopped Jake Paul before. The name Jake Paul revealed sent shockwaves through the combat sports world. It wasn't Canelo Alvarez, it wasn't Tommy Fury, and it wasn't another retired MMA fighter looking for one last payday. It was something unexpected, something that made people question whether Paul had finally lost control of his carefully crafted empire or if he was once again outplaying everyone in the game of hype. The internet exploded with reactions. Some fans were thrilled, excited to see Paul take on yet another high-profile opponent. Others were skeptical, wondering if this was just another strategic move to keep his name in the headlines without actually taking any real risks. But one thing was certain: Paul had everyone talking. And that was all that mattered. As the announcement spread, the reactions from the combat sports world came pouring in. Michael Bisping wasted no time adding his thoughts. "This guy will do anything for attention," Bisping scoffed in a reaction video. "He loses Canelo, can't lock in Tommy Fury, and now this? It's laughable. He doesn't want to be taken seriously, he just wants the cameras on him." Dana White, never one to hold back when it came to Paul, was just as blunt. "This isn't boxing," White said at a press event. "This is a circus." And that's exactly what Jake Paul wants. He doesn't care about becoming a real fighter. He just cares about selling pay-per-views. But Paul didn't care about the criticism. In fact, he thrived on it. Every insult, every doubt, Every dismissive comment only added fuel to his fire. He had built his career on proving people wrong, and this time would be no different. Training camp began immediately. Paul flooded social media with clips of his grueling workouts, showing himself sparring, running, and preparing like a man possessed. His coaches hyped him up, his team pushed the narrative, and little by little, the doubt started to shift into curiosity. Could he actually pull this off? The weeks leading up to the fight were filled with drama. The press conferences were explosive, with Paul delivering his usual brand of trash talk while his opponent fired back with equal intensity. The media ate it up. Headlines ran nonstop, debates raged across social media, and suddenly, the failed Canelo fight was a distant memory. Jake Paul had done it again. Fight night arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. The arena was packed with fans, some cheering for Paul, others hoping to see him finally humbled. The lights dimmed, the music hit, and as Paul made his way to the ring, he looked more confident than ever. This was his moment. The first bell rang, and the fight was on. From the opening round, it was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy night for Paul. His opponent was skilled, experienced, and determined to expose him as nothing more than a pretender. The punches were fast, the exchanges were brutal, and for the first time in his career, Paul found himself truly tested. But he didn't back down. Round after round, he fought with everything he had, pushing through exhaustion, ignoring the pain, refusing to quit. The doubters who had expected him to crumble were now watching in shock. He wasn't just surviving, he was fighting back. The final rounds were a war. Both men refused to give an inch, trading blows in the center of the ring, leaving everything they had under the bright lights. By the time the final bell rang, the crowd was on its feet, roaring in appreciation of the battle they had just witnessed. The decision went to the judges. The arena held its breath. And then, the announcement came. Jake Paul had won. The reaction was instant. His fans erupted in celebration, his team rushed the ring, and in that moment, all the doubts, all the criticism, all the insults seemed to fade away. He had proven something, not just to the world, but to himself. As he stood in the ring, his face bruised, his hands raised in victory, he grabbed the microphone and made one final statement. "You can say whatever you want about me," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But you can't say I'm not a fighter." The crowd roared. The critics fumed. And just like that, Jake Paul had rewritten the story once again. But the fight game never stops. And as Paul celebrated his victory, his next challenge was already waiting in the shadows. Because in boxing, the moment you prove yourself, the world is already asking, "What's next?"